I found this incredible connection to the intellectual history of homeopathy. For Newton, the idea was, can I take these laws of the universe that are consistent, mathematics, gravity, all the things, and then bring other things into it? Are there other ways that these universal laws can be understood, philosophical construct, and deployed an intervention? And in Hahnemann's case, the intervention is a medicine. Okay.
Thanks for tuning in to Season 4 of Strange, Rare, and Peculiar Homeopathy Podcast, where homeopathy lives, breathes, and evolves with Denise Straiges and Alastair Gray. We'll be exploring modern practice, research, and philosophy, from Hahnemann's radical insights to today's breakthroughs and discoveries. Get ready for homeopathy woes, feedback from pros, and the more you knows.
Hi everybody, how you doing? My name's Alastair Gray. I'm the Academic Director at the Academy of Homeopathy Education and the Research Director at the Institute for the Advancement of Homeopathy, and I'm here with...
Denise Straiges.
Yo.
Yo, what's up, baby?
Yo, sister.
Yes, I'm the President and Clinical Director of the Academy of Homeopathy Education and the Institute for the Advancement of Homeopathy, and I was just about to clean my glasses.
So you clean away, and I'm going to introduce this session because, folks, in this session, we're going to talk about history, but it's not going to be about dead people and sepia photos and long grey beards and a whole lot of irrelevant things, because history history really matters, and it's really, really relevant. And that's what we're going to be.
People.
What's that?
There are dead people.
Yeah, but it's not just about the dead people, because we're going to make it relevant. Contemporary.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that there's a difference. There's different types of history. There's names and dates and places.
Oh, there's boring dates and names. And then there's the history, which is how the hell did this happen, or how did we get here kind of history. And that's what...
Your educational taxonomy, there's level 4 history, and then there's level 6 and 7 history.
There you go. Bloom's taxonomy, Benjamin Bloom. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
But so I want to ask you, how your week's been to kick off? Tell me about your week.
Well, there's a reason why this podcast was not recorded on our usual day, and that's because I have had so many lectures in the last 2 weeks. It's just been lectures and teaching clinics.
And would that coincide with very, very late dinners?
Very late dinners, like 10 o'clock dinners a couple of times. Yeah, because one of the lectures was in the Australian time zone. So I was teaching on my Friday night for their Saturday. So that was 7 to 9 p.m. Yeah.
And what was the topic?
Yeah, so that one was on the alchemy and history of homeopathy. So one of my research topics is around the intellectual history of homeopathy and really looking at kind of the evolution of Hahnemann's ideas, where they came from, right? So sort of what's the origin story? And part of what I think happens when you learn the truth is that, we did a podcast a couple of years ago. Do you remember the name of it was The Truth May Change Your Opinion? Do you remember that?
I do that.
And I feel like that is, maybe that's going to be the name of today's. I don't know if we actually titled the podcast that, but I guess we could have the same title twice.
Yeah, why not? Part 2. Now, history and homeopathy related to homeopathy is usually all about Kant and Herring and homeopaths, and the homeopaths that are a couple of generations or 4 generations or 6 generations or 1 generation back, and that have in some way said something, and it depends on how it's delivered, but it usually sends people to sleep. The thing that I've observed with you and your research into the intellectual origins of homeopathy is that you're not really dealing with homeopaths. You are dealing with all sorts of other folks. Tell me about that.
Well, yes and no, right? So the history, it goes in 2 directions. There are a couple different parts to the research, or ways that the research gets delivered. And one of them is to go backward. So in other words, what were Hahnemann's discoveries, I guess you could say, because he was an empiricist. He sort of moved forward by making discoveries, but also going back. The intellectual history that I've been tracing goes back to 8th century Persian alchemy, chemistry, medicine, pharmacy, metallurgy. And then it kind of comes forward. But that's not where I started, because anytime you're researching something, you ask a series of questions. And this is 25 years of asking questions. It started at a convergence of two things. Actually, this is funny because I don't think you've ever heard, well, I don't think I've ever talked about it this way because I never thought about it till right now. And so what you have heard me talk about is that one of my favorite teachers, homeopaths of my life, was Eric Summerman, the late Eric Summerman, who he passed in 2007. And I had the privilege of having Eric as a teacher, but also as a colleague, because I worked in the practice that was associated with school and whatever. When I first started to study with Eric, he only did this twice. He did this class twice, and it was quite interesting. Basically, it started with the Big Bang, and then he went on from the Big Bang to look at how homeopathy unfolded from this idea. And so this class was going on concomitantly with the homeopathy education. So at that time, school was 4 days a month, and the first day of each month was, in the first year, was Eric's class, and literally started with the Big Bang. Now, remember, you would remember, people who are listening wouldn't know this, but I was already on my third rodeo with homeopathy education, and I had never heard anything even remotely like this. And to say it blew my mind is just like.
Are you talking from a chemical point of view? The substances that we end up using were formed from that beginning. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, basically the first remedy that he taught was hydrogen.
Right. Usually it's arnica.
Hydrogen and helium, lithium, beryllium, and he goes all the way through, right? But at the same time, we're doing basic homeopathy, right? But he's got this course. Anyway, and actually, it's so funny because you only informed me about an hour ago that this is what we were talking about, and it didn't even occur to me to look at those notes because two things just came together in my mind. So I'm kind of going off the cuff here, but to say I was blown away, and I wasn't there in person because I only got into that class because somebody died. This unfortunate event. They had a classroom. It held, say, 35 people, 34 people, whatever. And somebody died. Therefore, there was a space. And I moved to go to school to study there and ultimately to work there, whatever. I was listening to this on cassette tapes, right? So I'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning.
I'm sorry, on what?
On cassette tapes. Because
it sounds like an old primitive technology. Anyway, pray continue.
It was like when we did School of Homeopathy, where we got the cassette tapes, right?
It sounds ridiculous.
I know, now it does. So I would
cassette player.
Yeah. So I had little kids. Ben was a newborn. So I was getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I would listen to these cassettes. And then it was only a couple months because then I went in person, then I moved. Anyway, but as I'm listening in the beginning, I'm like, what is this? It blew my mind. And Eric he was a biochemist. So before becoming a homeopath, he's a biochemist, he was a cancer researcher. And so he influences his homeopathy would have been influenced through this. And of course, Hahnemann is a chemist. And so during the time when I was a student, you had to do all the chemistry. So, I had to study chemistry, and I had a chemistry tutor. Her name was Kristen. I still have in the notes there. I had how much I was paying her so I could learn this thing that was really didn't come naturally to me at first. Anyway.
Not me.
Because I was thinking about it through my evolving mind. My muggle mind is becoming a mind of a homeopath and learning. It's like going from quantitative to qualitative. It's like learning qualitative mathematics, right? It's like this whole different thing. Anyway, sorry, this intro is long because it's just coming to me as I'm saying it. So when I went through my notes later, right, I'm learning all this, and there's this way in which Eric he's basically presenting an evolutionary cycle is what he's doing. And he went through and looked at it went into taxonomy, because then he went in single-celled organisms and then into multi-celled organisms, goes through the plant kingdom, and ultimately you end up with, lac maternum, lac humanum, whatever. It goes through the arc of evolution. And it was just this a genius thing. And it was an entire year, but he talked about the qualitative value of numbers and all this stuff. Anyway, and I used to take notes, on paper, of course I did. And I had yellow legal pads, and I would have my yellow legal pad, then I would type it up and I would organize it into these binders.
I'm looking at them right now because I get to carry them every time we move house.
Well, actually, that one is right here, Natural Sciences. That's my Eric book. Anyway, so on one of my yellow pads, I write at the top of the page, Hahnemann was an alchemist. So 26 years ago, I didn't know, and what is that? And it's sort of funny. And so I'm like, I don't know what that is. Okay. At the same time, I'm not sure how all these things come together, but Dan Brown's first book comes out, the Da Vinci Code comes out. And for whatever reason, these two things like live in a similar space in my head, probably because they happened at the same time. But fast forward, as I am then delving into this study, I get interested, what is alchemy? And I just start to I got an alchemical tattoo. I don't know. I didn't even really know what this stuff is about. And then I start to learn more and more and more and more. And then I wind up at the same place where Dan Brown did his research, which is the Embassy of the Free Mind in Amsterdam, and studying Western Hermeticism and encountering all these random things happen.
Robert Langdon.
Exactly. These random things happen at the same time, including the Emerald Tablet, learning about the Emerald Tablet. I'm just reading whatever I can and looking at different traditions, trying to figure out, because by now Eric has passed. I can't ask him, what does he mean by this? And I learned later, because I badger people for information. And so Val O'Hanian, who was one of the other teachers, she, ran the practice, not just one of the other teachers. I mean, she was one of the other founders of the school. And so after Eric died, remember, we were in Minneapolis and we were visiting, you were doing work for Achina, and I went to lunch with Val. And I'm like, I need to understand, what was Eric's, talk to me about what his work was. Why does he say this? And she said, all I can tell you is that we spent a lot of time thinking about carbon. So I'm like, okay, carbon. And so I have literally, over the course of all these years, developed reams and reams and reams of information that only came together we had just moved here. So 2018. I mean, it had been coming together, but I was thinking about Isaac Newton, because I had learned that Newton was an alchemist and had written more on alchemy than all of his other work combined.
Yep.
But I only got to Newton because I was trail running. We had just gotten the dog, and I was running in the woods with the dog, and I'm just thinking, infinitesimal dose, the mathematics of homeopathy. How do you get from 1 to 100 to 1 to 50,000? And I'm having all of these thoughts. And then something clicks, infinitesimal dose, infinitesimal mathematics, Isaac Newton. So I come home and I get into going through my notes, and I find that the first translation of the Emerald Tablet that I ever found was Isaac Newton. And
he translated it.
He was lots of people translated it, but he did a translation, and I believe the original copy is extant, but it must be. But anyway, so I uncover this, and some of my students from early on, the first class at the school that would then become AG, I remember saying, if you're good, we'll go on a field trip, or we'll have candy. It was if you're good, we'll talk about alchemy before the end of the day. And I read this translation of the Emerald Tablet. Anyway, that set off this whole line of discovery and ask. And so I guess now we'll go to where I would have started, which was research, of course, begins with a question. What is your research question? And I ultimately came to the research question that is, what the hell is homeopathy? That really is my research question. And I know that might sound flippant, but it's not, because homeopathy means so many different things to so many different people. And it has become this thing where the pill, no matter how you decide to deploy it, you are a homeopath if you give someone this intervention, which is fine, right? It is what it is, but homeopathy is a thing. And I was trained as in a Hahnemannian way. Now, lots of people will be trained in a Kentian way. I would argue that most people are trained in the post-Kentian tradition in the English-speaking world. And if depending on where you are geographically, you will be trained in the lineage of your teacher and their geographic location of whatever way that their people interpreted it. Over in the English speaking countries, for the most part, you've got this Kentian thing that happens at the turn of the 20th century. And then you get in the UK now, in England, you would have the anti-Kents, right? The materialists, like
Anti-Kents.
Hughes was like the anti-Kent. He said anything, once you get beyond sort of the material dose, then it's nothing there. And so part of sort of the historical conversation has in it things like, what were the arguments that people were having over time? The thing that I learned when I went to graduate school was, and I didn't, now it feels really quaint, but like, I remember when I'm saying to the department chair, I'm like, I don't understand. How do you write like a historian? What does that mean? I was always a writer, but I didn't know how to write like a historian. And she would say, well, first you have to understand the conversation. And I'm like, what? And so you have to understand the conversation. Okay. And then she's like, and then you have to understand who's having the conversation. And then what do they bring to the conversation? What is their bias? Right? Because we all have a bias. Like my bias is Hahnemannian. Somebody else's bias might be material. Somebody else's might be Kentian, whatever. And you start to see the world through that lens.
Yeah.
And so I started to look at history now, or the history of homeopathy through different people's conversations, like the Kentians and the anti-Kentians. And right. And then eventually you just start peeling it back. Anyway, so would you want to ask me a question? I feel like I've just gone on this tangent that.
Oh, okay. Well, I've just been letting you run because it's endlessly fascinating. Let's go back to a point that you made, and that is that early on you went, Hahnemann's an alchemist. Now, I had a similar thought process on the other side of the world, maybe around the same sort of time, and found a book that was all about Paracelsus and alchemy. When you read about alchemy, I mean, somewhere I've got Carl Gustav Jung's book on alchemy and psychoanalysis, and I read about the first 2 pages, and it's impenetrable. And just so went on that journey of going, okay, what's the link therefore between Paracelsus as the obvious main definitive alchemist from the 16th, 15th century,
15th century,
15th century, and homeopathy?
Well, this is the thing, because that's the obvious leap, because this is where all these different things converge, right? I love how you said it. Paracelsus was the obvious, right? Why was he obvious? I mean, he was obvious because he holds this really big kind of place in history. His name alone, all of his names, Theophrastus, Bombastus, all this business.
My computer's named after him.
I know. And so you've got this influential figure. And I think Paracelsus becomes really interesting because, well, there's all the Jungian business, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think that homeopaths liked to grab onto him because of his sort of rebellious nature. His teachings were antithetical to the medical way of his times. And he did dabble in something adjacent to similars. And he did use sort of diluted substances, but he did something totally different, which is called it's spagyrics. And that sort of trajectory into the making of medicines would be more like an anthroposophical medicine, the Rudolf Steiner and like the Goethean influences, like the time of Goethe and Goethe's, work. Like there's this beautiful book, Goethe on Science. And Goethe and Hahnemann were sort of near contemporary. Steiner comes after, picks up that sort of Goethean philosophy and all this business, but they're like a second cousin twice removed to Hahnemann. But Hering, of course, picks it up and runs with it. So Constantine Hering, father of American homeopathy, he loves this idea of Paracelsus and then amasses the second largest Paracelsian collection in the world. And like, I've seen these letters because, I wrote my dissertation on herring and litbait, but mostly on herring. And so Herring would write letters to people in Europe and he would say, blah, 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 I'm working on this. Love to your sister. I hope you are well. By the way, if you encounter any Paracelsian material, please send it to me and I'm good for it. I'll give you the money. And so Herring is very much influenced by Paracelsian works. Like anybody who's seen that famous picture of Herring, or if you haven't seen it, just Google picture of Constantine Herring. It's 1R, not 2, that's the fish. Picture of Constantine Herring in his library or in his office in Philadelphia. And you'll see this room is just like sulfur central. And he's got all these books. And now in retrospect, I realized they're going to be mostly these Paracelsian books, which now are housed at the Drexel, archives. And we've seen them, and lots of them are in Old German. They've got lots of marginalia, and some of it would be in herring sand, some of it would be the person from whom he acquired it, whatever.
Yep.
But that's not that's not.
So what is it then?
So if we
This is Robert Langdon.
So why?
But what is it?
Langdon, my
What
chapter
happens?
would have to be shorter. You only get 3 faces of a page, right? If you're in a Dan Brown novel, you read the one page, the next chapter over. Anyway, so this Paracelsian idea, of course, gets anchored by Herring, which then takes us in a different direction. But it also is part of this Jungian idea, also not part of homeopathy. And so this is where the action is. The action in the history of homeopathy it's been misunderstood, misrepresented in so many different ways, right? You could say the historiography that compares it to allopathic medicine is going to have its language. If you have the wherewithal, the tenacity and fortitude to read Harris Coulter's doorstops that are 6 feet tall of, if medicine had been written in the language of the homeopaths, okay, then you've got the people that are writing about homeopathy, like that it's all about the man trying to get us down, like everything is about, we're going to be squashed by big pharma, and right. And so like people glom onto that. You can find something to hold on to about being oppressed and marginalized, something to love in the history of homeopathy. Persecuted. We are the persecuted minority, whatever. Okay, that's fine. But I asked a different question, right? So if you come to look at it, you go, okay, so if it isn't this Jungian and Herring and all this, well, then what is it? Hahnemann was a chemist. So you sort of have to deconstruct the whole thing and go like, how did we get here? This is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful life. My God, what have I done? So if you take it through a David Byrne lens, you have to deconstruct and say, okay, like where does he start? Now, there are all these like fun little bits of mythology about the alchemy, like Hahnemann was raised in Meissen. Did you say Meissen?
Meissen. Yeah,
Meissen, yeah. And his father was a painter in a porcelain factory. So, of course, I wanted to find out everything about the porcelain factory. Come to find out, a famous alchemist actually was there in the town of Meissen because the alchemy of the Eastern world was part of the tradition of the pottery, because it's about the transmutational process of turning one thing into another, and all of the, the clay bodies and the glazes and all the minerals.
Glazes, the chemistry behind the glazes in particular, right?
Never occurred to me that also as I'm a potter, right? Like this must have been in my mind from another life, but whatever. Okay, so this chemistry thing happens. So I look at that and I'm like, oh my gosh, from the time he was a baby, Hahnemann was destined to be an alchemist. I mean, maybe that had something to do with, maybe not at all. But then you kind of go forward in the trajectory of his life. He's only 22 years old, and he ends up at the Bruckenthal library, the Baron von Bruckenthal. He's in Transylvania, in Sibiu, Romania, and he has the largest collection of esoteric and occult materials of his day. Now, occult just means hidden, and that it doesn't mean like devil worship or whatever that people think it is. What it means in this sense is the information that should not be shared with the general public.
Muggles.
The Muggles. This is like the secret mystery material. So Hahnemann gets a job there, and he's the curator of, and there's like a story how he gets there, but I'm interested in, well, what does he see? Right? Because he's 22. Like,
he's 22.
He's
in
20.
charge of a giant library. What on earth does he have access to, and what was he reading?
Exactly. And so I knew I needed to go there, but it took me years to figure out because I knew I was going to have a limited amount of time. They're not just letting everybody into the restricted section. It's Transylvania, right? So it takes me years to like figure out, formulate all the questions. So I want to know by now, by the time I'm thinking about this, is like, well, what did he read? What was his influence? How did he discover this? And of course, this is before the Cinchona. This is before Essay on a New Principle.
Oh my God. So he's 22. This is 1877. 1777.
1777 to
Yeah.
1779. Is there just under 2 years? And then he goes missing for a year. And what happens? There's no information about what he does in that year, except that he was in the mountains studying metallurgy. Come on. So I find all this really compelling. Anyway, before I could go to Transylvania, I need to figure out what I'm asking. So I spent like these years. Remember all those books I would have at that table in our front room where I'm just like going through and learning about all the different alchemists and what did they do and what was their lineage. And I don't know when I let go of Paracelsus. It took a while because I had bought all the Paracelsian secondary source materials and all this business.
Living with a historian is really interesting because you realize, oh, I'm just going to make you a cup of tea, love. And then weeks later or years later, you hear that she was reading this particular thing at that particular time, making this particular link. It's really, really cool. Anyway, back to you.
Cool. And like writing, and I would write all this stuff by hand, have like this, these books of handwritten notes with stickies and cards in them, because I feel like that's how you make the connections in your mind, right? Now, I'm gonna pause for 1 second because when I teach this, like this is a podcast, this is a conversation about this. But when I teach it, there's a curriculum to this. So I've taught a 2-hour chunk of it for the Australian Homeopathic Society the other night. And every time I teach it, and I've taught it in various, for the Faculty of Homeopathy and stuff, I've taught parts of it over the years, but I've got like a week's worth of curriculum that when I have to teach it, I curate it into what chunk will I teach. And it's always really, for me, it's fun. Like it means I have an excuse to get back into that material and to organize a cohesive story that unfolds. I'm gonna jump ahead because part of the purpose, I think, of bringing this information out, because yes, I'm writing a book on it, and yes, I hope to turn it into a PhD dissertation. But there's a thing about it that feels relevant to us in our profession. And the part of that is that when we know what something is, it's like that idea, the truth will change your opinion, right? Once there's an understanding of what homeopathy actually is, that it is this incredible system of medicine that is based on universal laws. And when I say that on a podcast, people go, oh, okay. And then I'll say, okay, go to these aphorisms where Hahnemann talks about the luminous moons of Jupiter, and then go to these aphorisms where he talks about the ways in which one disease is stronger, similar cures another disease. But I think what becomes really powerful, or at least for me, what felt really amazing and reinforced the information was to see how Hahnemann would have picked this up over time. From whom would he have gotten this? So I can trace it through Isaac Newton, through Robert Boyle. There's this braided kind of intellectual history.
And
so
Ringo.
Say that again?
And Ringo.
Ringo Starr?
His real name?
What's Ringo Starr's real name?
Starkey.
Oh, right. I totally forgot. Sorry. So, right. And then George Starkey, he's kind of like the linchpin in this information. And so this braided information is intellectual history. In other words, Hahnemann he's a member of the Enlightenment quest. Like that's who he is, right? So what are they looking for during the Enlightenment? They're looking for a unifying system of medicine, akin to how Newton had a unified set of laws that explained the natural world. It's not just an apple falling on his head. He's then looking at it, right? He's got these books called Optics, where he's writing, and Optics 31, I found this incredible connection to the intellectual history of homeopathy. And it's these ideas around, well, for Newton, the idea was, can I take these laws of the universe that are consistent, mathematics, right, gravity, all the things, and then bring other things into it? Are there other ways that these universal laws can be understood, philosophical construct, and deployed an intervention? And in Hahnemann's case, the intervention is a medicine. Okay.
In other words, you're telling us that Hahnemann, the number of languages he had and the genius that he had and the history that he had, didn't blow this out of his backside.
No.
He's reading and he's reading this, and he read that and he read that, and he read it because it's in his little book, right?
He's not just reading, but then he's trying it out. He's experimenting.
Mm.
So homeopathy is it's a cumulative system. He's already working on something. And from what I understand from what he was known to have been, the lore in Bruckenthal is that he was very interested in a particular book. And I don't want to talk about all of the names of the people, but he was interested in this particular book. And so it's a book that's written in 3 volumes. So I've gone and done a deep dive. There is a historian who focuses on this one particular book, and I was able to sort of look at that, which then gave me clues to other people in this lineage. Anyway, so we go back to this braided idea. So you've got Newton and Boyle, and you've got the intellectual ideas, the quest for a universal system of medicine. Hahnemann, he's a chemist, he's a doctor, so of course this is going to be where his mind is. And then he comes around, and then it becomes about the process of making the medicines. These two things are separate. Remember, he is only utilizing the potentized substances exclusively after 1830, 1834. So by the time we're in 1834, chronic diseases is already out. Between 1816 and 1828, when he's working on the chronic diseases, he makes a huge change philosophically. He says, oh, I understand basic foundational principles, give one remedy, the totality, the minimum dose, stimulate the healing, right? That. But then he says, it doesn't fully work, right? We talked about this in many podcasts, the 1828 problem. So then he comes back, and this is when he refines the philosophical theory, and he begins to make changes in the medicines. What I talked about, this is kind of the fun part on Friday night, was looking at the medicines in chronic diseases. So once you have a question, then you can look at things in a totally different way. So what are the tranches of remedies that Hahnemann included in chronic diseases? How can we understand them in light of these incredible discoveries that he makes down the road? So for example, ammonium carb. You go, oh, ammonium carb. It's
ammonium carb.
Women of reproductive issues, whatever, flushing, you have like your keynotes and you give it in some cases. But it turns out that remedy was big in alchemy, big in the alchemical tradition. It comes from a stag's horn. The question comes, well, what does that represent? Well, in various alchemical lineages, the stag's horn represented a whole lot of things, including vitality and new life, because they shed the antlers every year and they grow a new pair. And so then there is also this regenerative capacity. What do we use ammonium carbonicum for in the medical world? It's smelling salts. So there's this whole theme around what I now call sort of the corpse revivers. Because once he realizes this, then he goes back, and then you get carbo-veg and carbo-animalis. Carbo-veg, the corpse reviver. You give it to a person when they're on their deathbed. It's smelling salts. Ammonium carbonicum is a smelling salt. It brings a person back when they are looking like they're going, they're going down, going to the next place. And so deconstructing the history by asking a series of questions and seeing how they come together. I guess at the end of the day, what that means, to me, and probably why I feel so committed to the truth in our profession, is once you see the truth, the rest of it seems ridiculous. It just seems absurd, because Hahnemann does these amazing things, like he creates the system of medicine based on universal laws that can be applied in everything from a lightning strike to complex autoimmunity. And then he develops the pharmacy that goes along with it. And this way in which he moved from, well, I left out a piece to explain this. So if we go to the alchemical part of the tradition, or the alchemical piece, the alchemists are looking for not how to turn lead into gold, but how to come up with the universal elixir. How do we extend life? So if you watch Harry Potter 1, Nicholas Flamel, the noted alchemist, he lives to be like 900 years old. And how does he do it? Because he's got the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone becomes this key ingredient for longevity. So that's like a very Reader's Digest version of the whole thing. But throughout time, the alchemists are looking for the substance, the base substance that can be used to make the elixir. There was this quest for all things that were golden, right? Because this idea of making philosophical gold, turning lead into gold. And so what are golden substances? Well, if they come from life, then you're going to look at your pee. And so this alchemist, he was in the 17th century. He was a German alchemist called Henning Brand. And so he pees into an alembic. He calls it his golden stream. He heats it up and it makes light. And he's like, oh, this eerie golden glow. And it glowed for like hours. Well, that's phosphorus. So phosphorus, the light bearer, actually came from a German guy peeing into an alembic and lighting it, heating it up until it glows. And so Hahnemann moves from...
I went straight to the Jackass movie. Anyway, keep going.
Which we do need to see in theaters. Yeah. Okay. So Hahnemann moves from the quest of the alchemist to find the primary substance, the prima materia. And he says, actually, it's not the substance, it's the process.
Yep.
And that's when he begins to work on how to create a substance that is both powerful and safe to remove the toxicity. Well, you could, again, if we're talking about process, can trace that all the way back to the 8th century. So I've been able to find the lineage of alchemists who were making medicines more safe through these very distinctive processes that Hahnemann then brings and culminates in aphorisms 269 and 270. So go ahead, what were you going to say?
Potentially, dispelling the myth of potency being developed.
Oh my God. Okay. This is what we have to deal with.
Yeah.
So
yeah. No,
this is what we have to deal with. I got a phone call from someone who I love very dearly, who said, I'm teaching a class on the history of homeopathy. Can you tell me about Hahnemann's discovery of potency from riding a horse and the people at the end, or a carriage, pulling in a horse and carriage, and the people at the end of his home visits, their remedies were so strong because they'd been jostled in the buggy.
In the carriage, in the horse and carriage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that how Hahnemann developed his ideas on potentization, on dynamization?
I'm going to say it's a hard no. But
that's a big fat no.
It's a hard no. However, there actually, and I could see where this has come from, because once he's got this potentization idea in process, he says, don't store the remedies in liquid, because if they get jostled around, then it's going to inadvertently potentially increase the potency. I don't know how much weight he gave to that, but I wonder if that led into the fallacy. But you get to aphorisms 269 and 270. 269, between the 5th and the 6th editions, Hahnemann goes, oh, there's a whole new paragraph. And the paragraph basically says any substance can be potentized, even those considered to be inert. So in other words, Hahnemann moves from in the beginning, right? Homeopathy comes from the herbal tradition because he's reading Cullen's Materia Medica. He discovers the cinchona business. Then he tries other medicines on himself and on his friends, proving out the law of similars, but he's working within the plant tradition. And in the very beginning, most of the remedies are plants. Once he gets to 1828 in chronic diseases, he's rethinking how plants and minerals and animal substances work as a part of the healing paradigm.
Yep.
And how some of them are more appropriate than others as an anti-miasmatic remedy. And so what he's doing at that point is he's creating a distinction between both acute and chronic illness and how we treat it, and the substances that are appropriate for those interventions, which is really cool. So that starts in 1828. 1833 is the 5th edition of the Organon. That's when he says the dose needs to be repeated, but not in the same form. He says never repeat the remedy. So don't give 30C daily. If you're going to give a repeated remedy, you need to put it in water. You need to succuss it, because that is going to ostensibly change what the delivery is and render it much more appropriate for healing and less likely to aggravate. Now, we all know from our practices that sometimes we wind up repeating the same potency or whatever, especially, but we'll just leave that as sort of part of the evolutionary process. Anyway, that's 1833. By 1834, he's potentizing everything, because he goes through a process of discovery. And so by the time you get to the 6th edition of the Organon, you get to footnote 270, and all the different things. He's got, I think it goes up to H, I think. I know it
Maybe,
goes,
you're right. Yep.
I think it goes to H. Anyway, but he's talking about the fact that with the 50 millesimal remedy, he's finally able to extract spirit from matter. And this idea of the extraction of spirit from matter, this is the goal of the alchemists. They want to release the spirit from the material. That is the goal of the alchemists. Release the spirit from the material. This is what Hahnemann manages to do. And he gives it a purpose, right? Because the purpose is in the creation of these medicines. And so when he's in 270, when he's talking about the 50 millesimals, yeah, it only goes up to G. It does, there's no H, it's G is the last in 270. Anyway, when he's talking about this, he says that it is the most perfect.
Most perfect.
Most perfect. Okay. So the 6th edition of the Organon, he's able to release spirit from matter, and he has created the most perfect delivery. So he's reduced the number of succussions, and he's increased the amount of dilution. Water as the operative agent. So when people say Hahnemann would have written a 7th edition of the Organon and an 8th edition of the Organon, and he might have, but he still had a year to be working on this more before he died. He didn't change it, and he said he got to the most perfect. And the word perfect is a really important word. In fact, in the talk that I gave on Friday night, I looked at, or I demonstrated how Hahnemann used the terminology around perfecting things throughout his work, The Organon in Chronic Diseases, and all of the old German terms that would have been used for describing that idea of perfection. Because again, that's the goal of the alchemist, is to create the most perfect form. How's that? Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, and it makes sense as to why I'm shriveling and wasting away, and why I've not been fed in the last 2 weeks.
Oh my goodness.
I am totally intrigued by some of these names. You mentioned Boyle a couple of times. Can you just give us a little primer on Boyle?
Yeah. Robert Boyle was, I mean, he's considered to be the father of modern chemistry. And he was really
There was Lavoisier.
Lavoisier. Also, yeah, he was a contemporary of Boyle's. He's not one, his work doesn't really feed in. He's peripheral to Hahnemann's stuff. Yeah.
He got guillotined in the revolution.
He did indeed. Oh, and interesting. Another thing, speaking of the guillotine, I don't know why it made me think about that, but all these guys in Hahnemann's tradition, one of the things that they were really against was Galen. Oh boy, they didn't like Galen. Do you remember in that paper that I wrote at Hopkins about George Starkey, where he challenged the Galenists to a duel, where they had to produce cures without using any of their toxic substances or whatever? It was so interesting. I'm just looking here at a couple talking about Isaac Newton, just because I've got if for those of you who are looking at this on video, you can see, just for fun, that is, yeah. So I do my initial work by hand, and then I also use a couple of apps to keep it in order, but I love this process. Anyway, so Isaac Newton, just a couple of things about sort of this idea of Newton and Hahnemann were both in the tradition of natural philosophy. And Hahnemann talks about being a natural philosopher, but Newton says, quote, do not bodies act upon one another at a distance? And by what means are these actions performed? And then he says, quote, there are certain powers, virtues, or forces by which the particles of bodies act upon one another. And so what Newton is working through here is similar to what you get from Hahnemann in aphorisms 9 to 12. But this is where Hahnemann then moves into the idea of the magnet. So the magnet, and Hahnemann talks about magnets, in the organon.
Heaps.
Heaps, because it's a way to sort of talk about the sort of mechanism, right? And so magnets were one of Newton's primary examples of invisible action. And so Hahnemann picks that up directly. And Newton writes about this idea of forces acting invisibly through matter, not just by mechanical contact. And so he uses examples of gravity and magnetism and electrical attraction. Hahnemann uses those same examples, which suggests, it doesn't prove, but it suggests that Hahnemann had, if not access to Newton's teachings and work, he would have been in that intellectual milieu of conversation. And Newton is really interesting because a lot of his work went missing. And then it was discovered here in Philadelphia at what used to be called the Chemical Heritage Foundation, and it's now called, I think, the Chemical History Museum. It's on 3rd and Chestnut if you're a Philly person. Anyway, but one of the scholars whose work has been most influential to me, Dr. Lawrence Principe from Johns Hopkins, which was how I wound up there. And Larry's work is just unbelievable. And he's written a number of books along with this professor from the University of Indiana, Newman. And together they wrote this book called, actually, I think this was just William Newman. Yeah, Newton the Alchemist, which is a great book. It lives here with my first edition of the Organon.
So, folks, if you're putting down your cup of tea, you got to be careful where you put it, because it's going to be on an open book about the Rosicrucians. There's going to be a tottering pile of manuscripts somewhere that the cat is. What was the book that cat threw upon last week? Oh, that was my research.
That was one of yours.
Yeah, we had an accident where I think it was Hildegard of Bingen threw up on Kunjalal's writings on homeopathic education, but that's another story.
We were sent a picture by child number 1 of, I'll clean this up, but I want you to know I'm doing it.
I'm putting it in my book.
Another Newton thing. So if you're thinking about, like, what does this intellectual history thing mean? It's like, it's the history of ideas and concepts and their transmission, right? And how does one thing become another, it's really important because it allows you to sort of see historical actors on their own terms. What did they do? What did they bring to the conversation? How did they get there? Because yes, there are brand new ideas. Of course there are, right? People have that aha moment, but it often comes from something else. You ask various questions and you get to various things. So Newton has this thing that he's looking for, which is, reading this from my notes. So, and for the students out there, one of the things that's important to do is to take your notes in your own words so that you don't accidentally plagiarize. This is a study technique, or it's actually an organization of information technique that I love. It's called the Zettelkasten. The Zettelkasten idea, if you're into sort of study productivity and stuff, it's like my side hustle. I love it. Anyway, Zettelkasten it's this concept of taking notes on individual cards, and then you organize them by concept. And what the guy who invented it, he was German, I forget his first name, but what he said was, if you synthesize the information, you are doing the first step in learning, and that you're then engaging your mind to come up with another, to come up with your own ideas. And so you synthesize the information on one side of the card, and then you put your reference on the other side. I was trying to do it by hand. I switched to an app called Obsidian, which allows you to do that in link thoughts, which is really cool. Anyhow, but it all starts on paper. So in my words, so this is Newton's work implies a conviction that nature contains hidden but lawful processes of transformation. Nature operates according to discoverable laws invisible causes can be inferred from observable effects, and careful experimentation reveals hidden principles. And so the synthesis of this idea is unseen forces govern visible phenomena, which is basically what Hahnemann is turning this idea of the law of similars into. So anyway, there's so much more. I mean, like I said, I could go on for days.
It's awesome. Thank you so much for that. This is the background noise in my life, and so I'm infinitely fascinated by it. And I think it is so relevant for today. And whatever the conversation that's going on out there, albeit about homeopathy being the pill, homeopathy being the application of same with the indiscriminate use of nosodes or whatever, it's really critical to understand the origins of what it actually is. And it also has coincided with another important development this week, and that is a publication of the consensus statement, the AIH-driven consensus statement on the definition of homeopathy. And if you want to have a look at it, you can go to the AIH, you can go to NASH, and you can go to advancehomeopathy.org. What is homeopathy? And you're going to find a definition, a place, a stick in the sand where we are really comfortable with this statement about who we are, what we do, and our place in it. And our place is unashamedly rigorous and academically driven and based on evidence, not driven by evidence, but informed by evidence.
Right.
And we're really happy there.
And safety. And actually, a little history of this consensus statement came about because so many of us were exposed to evidence of harm through the misapplication of homeopathic medicines, not the misappropriation of the philosophy of homeopathy and the medicines that go along with it, but the indiscriminate use of the medication, overuse, oversimplification, coming up with it from whatever intuition you had, and then giving medicine to sick kids. And so a group of stakeholder organizations met over the course of, I want to say it's been about 5 years.
About 5 years, yeah.
About 5 years, and talked a lot about risk management for the profession. And the intention is not in any way to say to other people, don't do what you do. We can't control what other people do. And people have, they have free will, and censorship never really helps. However, I think within a profession that is unregulated, self-governance is really key. And so what we can all do is say, we feel comfortable with this 230-year history of the application of these principles and the use of these interventions. And we're signing on to that consensus statement. It's just basically saying that the Hahnemannian lineage in homeopathy is what we are adhering to. If there are people who aren't, that's okay. That's on them. And that's fine. And there's nothing that we could do about something like that. So there's nothing to do other than speak for all of us who are practicing according to the 230 years of the principles. And so the consensus statement is something for people to come on to. And if somebody doesn't want to, then they don't need to. That's okay too. But we feel like if someone were to get hurt, we just want to be clear about what we're doing and what it's based on. And then, because we can account for it with the history and the clinical evidence. And then people who are using the medicines in a different way, then they'll just need to account for it in their way, right? What are the principles that are guiding that? And so it's not a call out, it's a call in. So all are invited to be a part of it. And if you don't feel called to be a part of it, that's okay too.
Beautiful. All right, folks, that's it's time for a breath and a cup of tea, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. See ya.
AHE is changing the face of homeopathy education by raising the bar through rigorous academics and unparalleled clinical training delivered live through the soulful use of cutting-edge technology. AHE prepares its students to become fully rounded homeopathic practitioners from anywhere in the world. Apply today at ahe.online.